Hello and welcome to Advice from Your Advocates. I'm Bob Manor from Manor Law Group, and Advice from Your Advocates is a podcast that we talk about interesting things and people that are related to working with seniors in the long-term care industry. So today we have Donna MacKenzie, a colleague of mine that I greatly respect, that I've known for quite a while and has done some very interesting legal work and is just a great person. So Donna, could you introduce yourself for a second?
Yes. Hi, Bob. Thank you so much for having me on. I am a nursing home and abuse lawyer. I also handle cases involving injuries at assisted living facilities, adult foster care homes, and I also specialize in medical malpractice.
And as many of you may know, I don't sue people. That's not the type of lawyer that I am. And I have a great deal of respect for Donna in dealing with those cases. And sometimes they can be very difficult on those elder abuse cases. So we're going to talk about one in particular, and then we're going to talk about some ideas of how to make sure you protect your family. Okay, so I had mentioned this case. If you've come to one of our boot camps, our elder law and advocacy boot camps, I had mentioned this case last year about an independent living. So the case is Kermath versus Independent Village. And can you give us a little bit of details about Mrs. Kermath, I think Virginia Kermath, and tell us what was going on and how this case all came about?
Yeah, absolutely. So Virginia Kermath was living at home with her daughter, who was helping to take care of her. She was 89 years old, and it was getting to a point where she needed more supervision and more care than her daughter could provide to her at home. And so her daughter found Independence Living Facility, Independence Village, and her mom moved into Independence Village. At the time that her mom moved in, her mom was on medication for dementia. She had cognitive impairment, and that was pretty consistent with the level of cognition of the other residents who were living there as well. You know, her daughter was able to see the other residents, interact with them when she would visit her mom, and they were all of the same or similar age. And some had the same cognitive level as her mom, and some were not, their cognitive level was not as good as her mom's. But they were all living there. And her mom had assistance with daily living tasks from a company that is associated with Independence Village.
And just as a reminder to folks, independent living is distinguishable from assisted living, memory care, nursing home, in that independent living, you pay one company for room and board and a different company for care. So a lot of us kind of get all those mixed together. And so, it's sometimes I see people in independent living and the family says she's in the nursing home. There's different levels of care. And that's the one thing that distinguishes independent living is you do not write one check for room and board and care. You write two checks to two different companies, right?
Yeah, except in this case, there was a little unique fact, which was that Independence Village was an independent living facility and not a home for the aged, only because of a loophole in the law.
Yeah, that's a good point, Donna, that a lot of the places, most people don't realize this either, that from a licensing standpoint, a lot of the places out there might be completely unlicensed because the licensing in Michigan doesn't have a license for assisted living or memory care or independent living. Those aren't licenses. So they could be home for the aged, they could be full nursing home, and there is adult foster care, but some of them are just not licensed at all. Is that the case here where they were not licensed?
Yes, that is the case. And with these types of facilities, and we refer to it sometimes as the wild, wild west. I mean, there's facilities that are licensed, there's facilities that are not licensed. And, depending on what they're offering and what they're providing, they may or may not have to be licensed.
And that's a good point, and I like to use those terms. You'll hear me use those terms a lot: independent living, assisted living, memory care. But the reality is, Donna's right, that these are more marketing terms. She says, well, less, and what it means is there's no meaning behind that. A lot of people assume, oh, if it's an assisted living, they must be regulated, they must have regulators come in. That's not the case necessarily. It depends on what their licensing is, and they're not required to be licensed or meet a certain standard. So something that calls themselves assisted living or calls themselves independent living, they kind of define the terms of that because there's no legal requirement or regulatory requirement that says you can only use this term if you meet these standards.
That's correct. And
so in this particular case, I believe that you were the law firm that initiated this case from its very beginning. And so unfortunately, we're going to have to get into the bad part of the case and what happened the one night.
Yeah. So one night, Virginia, it was actually in the early morning. She walked out of her room, her apartment, and her apartment was inside a building. So her apartment door was an internal apartment door. And she was able to make it to the exit of the building and walk outside. Now, she had wandered in the building before, and the staff there were aware that she had wandered around the building before. And one prior incident, they had called her caregiver to come and get her because she was in a different part of the building and she needed assistance getting back to her apartment. So, and this is not uncommon. This is not an uncommon behavior in elderly individuals who have memory impairment, unfortunately. So she was able to make it to the exit door. She was able to open the exit door. There was no alarm. There was no camera. There was no security. There was no monitoring, nothing. She walked outside of the building, and it just happened to be a very cold, winter, snowy morning. And the door closed behind her. No one knew she was out of the building. There was no one around to help her get back into the building, and she had no idea how to get back in the building. And that door locked. You needed a key or key card or whatever it was to get back in the building. So,
and in a case like this, any person might be, in a bad situation if the door locks behind them and they're outside. Particularly an older person that might have some difficulty with, mobility and things like that. But that's combined with the fact that she also had dementia and really didn't have the executive decision making to be able to deal with this situation.
Right. And, she was in a nightgown and she had no footwear on and she was standing in the snow. And so she was out there so long that she became hypothermic, and meaning her body temperature dropped to dangerously low levels, and her feet became frostbite from the cold and the snow. And so she had to be hospitalized. Once she was finally found by someone who was coming to work that morning, she had to be hospitalized. Her frostbite on her feet got so bad that it became infected and necrotic and caused her to have an overwhelming infection. And she did not recover from the incident, unfortunately.
So she died.
She did.
And so obviously there was a lawsuit about this, and Osmond MacKenzie, Peacock and Wallace was the lawyers that represented it. This was your case, correct, Donna?
Yes, it was.
And so walk us through what happened in the court system. And the exciting news is the end of the story, or not quite the end of the story, but the current end of the story, because the story continues. But walk us through the what happened at the different court levels.
Yes. So we had filed the case in Oakland County Circuit Court. And, we had taken depositions. We had gathered evidence. The evidence showed that the staff there knew that our client, Ms. Kermath, was not supposed to go outside unsupervised. They testified that if they had ever seen her try to leave, they would have redirected her and brought her back. The evidence showed that the company that was affiliated with Independence Village had initially been hired to give Miss Kermath her medications, including her dementia medications. They were not giving her the medications correctly. There were a lot of issues with the level and, the quality of care she was getting. So they recommended to Miss Kermath's daughter that she hire a private caregiver. So Miss Kermath had hired a private caregiver to take care of her. And so we had uncovered all these facts, and we also uncovered that there was a prior incident where she'd been, found to have wandered before, and was found in another location in the building. And it was pretty clear that during the time that she was there, she was declining. And from the depositions of the people who work for Independence Village, it was also clear that they had no mechanism in place to assess on a regular basis the residents that were living there to make sure that it was safe and appropriate for them to continue living there. Despite all of that evidence that we uncovered, the Independence Village filed a motion, and they argued in their motion that they did not owe any duty of care to Ms. Kermath, and that what happened to her was not foreseeable. And unfortunately, the circuit court judge granted that motion.
So at that point, if it hadn't gone any further, the court case is dismissed, right?
The court case was dismissed. So we, had a conversation with our client, and we felt very strongly that it should be appealed, and she agreed. So we appealed it to the Court of Appeals. Again, the Court of Appeals, unfortunately, made the same finding as the circuit court, and they determined that the dismissal was appropriate, and that, the Independence Village did not owe a duty to Ms. Kermath.
And that's the point at which I've discussed this with some of the folks that might be listening today, is we had talked about this case at the Elder Law and Advocacy Boot Camp and mentioned about this going to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals upholding the circuit court's decision. And I had, until recently, understood that was going to be the end of it. But Donna doesn't give up that easy. So tell us what happened next.
No, definitely not. So we appealed it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court actually came back and asked for a number of specific questions to be answered. And so we argued some very specific questions. The first was whether or not an independent, unlicensed senior living facility owes a duty of care to its residents. And Michigan law recognizes, and has recognized for a very long time, it's very well established, that there is a special relationship between a landlord and a tenant. And despite these prior rulings, the defendant, Independence Village, that was their argument. Their argument was, we are a landlord-tenant. But we're nothing more. But the thing is, when you have a landlord-tenant relationship, you then owe a duty. So that was a central point, and that admission was very important, because by admitting that they were a landlord-tenant relationship, that gave rise to a special relationship, which gives rise to a duty. And a landlord has a duty to keep the common areas of a building safe and in reasonable condition. And the standard that's used to determine whether or not the landlord is keeping the area safe and in reasonable condition for the tenants is a reasonable person standard. And so the lower courts had applied a subjective standard, and they were, they had looked at whether or not Independence Village knew that it was possible that someone could, that Miss Kermath could wander outside of the door in the middle of the night, when really what they should have done was they should have applied a reasonable person standard. Could a reasonable person have foreseen that in a building with residents who are, the average age was 85 and older, and there were individuals who had cognitive impairments, and importantly, they were living there and paying a premium to live there because they couldn't live at home alone, right? And so The question is whether a reasonable person could foresee that something like this could happen. And the Supreme Court got it right. And the Supreme Court said, yes, this is something that a reasonable person could foresee.
Yeah,
And so
that's really exciting. When I saw this case, I was really excited, and congratulations on the result there.
Yeah, it was. And, the court also found, as a matter of law, that it was foreseeable that this would happen and that the facility did owe a duty of care to protect that doorway and to protect that exit, whether that be through some kind of an alarm or video monitoring system or whatnot. They found as a matter of law that they did in fact owe that duty to protect its residents from exiting the building.
And so where does the case go from here? You won at the Supreme Court level. So what's next?
So now Ms. Kermath finally gets her day in court. So we finally get the case sent back to the circuit court, which is the trial court. And we're going to be able to present Ms. Kermath's case to a jury with the finding of law that Independence Village owed her a duty, and that it was foreseeable that she could have exited out that door and become injured.
I think that's an important element that you just mentioned. A lot of folks don't realize how the court systems work, and that, she never even got her day in court. She never even got a chance to, the family never got a chance to tell the story. It's not like it is on TV, is it?
No, it is not. The tool that was used for the court to dismiss the case was summary disposition. And that tool is not something that is supposed to be used, overused by the court system. Summary disposition is only supposed to be used when there is no question of fact. And we clearly had so many questions of fact in this case. I think it was improper for the court to use it, and I think it was improper for the Court of Appeals to uphold it.
So now the family's going to have their chance to have this move forward, go before a jury, right? Correct,
yes. So we will be able to argue to a jury that Independence Village should be held accountable for what happened to Ms. Kermath, and a jury will be able to decide that question.
Well, that's great, Donna, and really appreciate all your work on these types of matters. I know that you're an advocate against elder abuse, and a strong advocate. So if it's okay, I'd like to ask you some questions or some tips that the families might have to learn from cases that you've worked on and just your general knowledge of the area. Are there things that families should be looking out for before they move into a care setting, before they move, towards, they realize they cannot meet the needs of their mom or their dad or their spouse? Do you have any tips for us as far as things to be on the lookout for when you're trying to make that decision?
Yeah, and I think this case highlights one of those important things to do, which is check the facility to see if it's licensed. Mm-hmm. Check to see if there's any oversight. If it's a nursing home, if there's a website called Medicare Compare, you can put the name of the nursing home in there, and you can see what level of rating it has. They do a 5-star rating. That is not always, an accurate portrayal of what goes on in the facility, but it is a helpful tool. There's another website where you can look up other facilities, so non-nursing homes, assisted livings, homes for the aged, adult foster care, and you can find out if they're licensed. And you can also find out, you can look and see, and this is true for nursing homes too, you can look and see what complaints have been made against them in the past and whether or not those complaints have been substantiated or not. And, there's a lot of issues with investigating incidents, reporting of abuse. There's issues with pressure sores. You can kind of tell if a facility is understaffed. You're going to see more neglect going on with the residents. You're going to see more pressure sores. You're going to see more falls. You're going to see more incidents. And so I really do think the number one thing to do would be to research the facility online the second advice that I mostly give to people, and I'm sure you do this as well, but I always suggest that they find a place that is close to home that they
Oh,
can
right.
visit as often as possible. So the more presence of family, I think the more attention, that the resident's going to get because they're going to know that someone's keeping tabs on what's going on.
Donna, that's so important, and I want to circle back in a second to that website because you're right. That's an excellent website, and it's the licensing website. So we'll come back to that. But you led right into a question that I had, and absolutely, you're going to get better care if you're there, if you are observing, if you come at different times of the day, if you
Yep.
can, it's just human nature, and I feel like most places, most people are well intentioned, but it's human nature that if you've got people watching you, you're probably gonna do, a little bit better job than if nobody's watching you. It's
Right.
all that's just human nature. It's part of the human experience that we live. But what that kind of leads into a question I had for you about during this, especially the beginning parts of COVID and extending on for quite a bit, where there really was, we were all quarantined for a little bit, but folks in the long-term care setting were more aggressively quarantined, and it was a very, very difficult situation. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that period of time where families really weren't able to go in and watch what was going on, and
Yeah.
if you had any, insight onto that.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have received a lot of calls about things that happened during that time frame. We're still receiving calls about it. When you close the doors to the nursing home and you don't let anybody in, there's no accountability. And there's no one to identify if there's not enough staff on the floor or what the staff are doing. And I think there were some significant issues with understaffing during this whole time frame. And so, and you've got people in these facilities who are vulnerable adults who maybe not be able to report something on their own or voice a concern or even tell someone else about a concern. And so I think that it was really unfortunate what happened to these individuals during COVID. And we're just seeing terrible, terrible things that happened in these facilities during that time. I'm not saying that every facility, is terrible, but we have seen some very, very terrible things. Even during COVID, when it all began and there was, this need to isolate and quarantine and wear the PPE. There was one facility that was big in the news around that time because the director of nursing locked all that PPE in a closet and told the staff that if they were dumb enough to think that the PPE was going to work, then they were too dumb to work there.
Oh my goodness.
And yeah, one of the employees called the state and had the state come in. And in that building, I think it was every single resident got COVID.
Oh my
because
goodness.
they refused. The director of nursing refused. And another telling thing about that story is the director of nursing was not fired.
Oh,
She resigned because she felt like her authority was being questioned and that she wouldn't be respected if she stayed at the facility any longer. So, there's very terrible things happened during COVID. And unfortunately, these our vulnerable elderly loved ones were the victims of it.
And one of the things that we have to remember was this was mandatory, and it wasn't just mandatory for the licensed
Right.
facilities. It was mandatory for any independent living, assisted living. They had very specific rules that came down from federal and state government where they had to follow these quarantine rules, and they continued for much longer than the rest of us. A lot of the rest of us were already going out to dinner and doing those types of things, and we still couldn't visit our loved ones in some care facilities where they had very restrictive rules. For a while, they had things like, well, you can see your loved one, but only outside. Well, this is Michigan. That doesn't work out so well. And
No.
then, they often were saying, oh, you got to keep a 6-foot distance. And so you can't hug your grandma or you can't hug your spouse. it was just so very difficult. We have a mutual colleague and friend, Allison Herschel, who's, I think, accurately called this a humanitarian crisis during the time period, because you think of all these folks that they don't really have the ability to understand everything that's going on around them, and all they know is these people that are their loved ones that they might not even be able to call by name anymore, but they still recognize them as their loved ones, are no longer coming around anymore. And they can't figure out an explanation for it, or that they've been confined to their rooms and they can't even go out to the, where there might be activities or other, things like that. For example, when people are going into rehabilitation places for physical therapy, occupational therapy, things like that, a lot of that therapy had to occur in the room versus in the therapy, centers that they all have. So it was just such a difficult time. I'm glad that a lot of those rules have now been minimized, and I hope that we never end up going back to that again. So it was just such a terrible time period. A lot of people ended up bringing their parents home. Sometimes it just wasn't possible, or their loved one home. But that creates a whole other set of issues for families, and trying to make sure that the person's going to get the level of care that they need.
Right.
So it was a very difficult time. I did want to circle back to something that you said, Donna. Can we put the website on the well, I guess if you're watching the video of this podcast, you'll be able to see the website. It is, if you're listening to the audio, I can tell you how to get to the website. You basically Google Michigan Business Licensing. It's through the Department of Labor and Economic Affairs or something like that. It might not be the exact title of it, but you Google to check somebody's license or check a license. Then you click on business versus personal license, and business, then it gives you the option of picking what type of license. And there's licensing for nursing homes, there's license for adult foster care, there's licensing for home for the aged. And then if you click on the end of it, you can click on the county and search all the ones in that county. And if you click on the individual places, it will then go through and show you any investigations they've done, if they've come out and responded to complaints, and the reports that are there. And I think those are very helpful. It was particularly helpful during COVID, or obviously COVID is still going on, but seeing the response to COVID, because a lot of the complaints were how they're handling the COVID issues. And so it's a very useful website. We go to that website all the time. So Donna, I wanted to talk to you about another matter. So it's not quite in the long-term care realm, but it's an awful situation, and you were able to help a lot of folks in this, and that's the Dr. Fada scenario from, I don't know how many years, was that 4 or 5 years ago, where we found out about Dr. Fada? And so can you just tell us briefly the story and how you were able to help some of the families that were victims of Dr. Fada?
Yeah, so Dr. Fada was an oncologist who was treating patients for cancer with chemotherapy, and sometimes those patients did not have cancer, and sometimes they didn't need the chemotherapy that he was giving to them. And so there was a whistleblower who came forward, and the federal government went after Dr. Fada, both criminally and under a False Claims Act kind of claim. And so they were able to recover from Fada for, billings that he had collected from Medicare or Medicaid that were improper. So they got they held him accountable on the financial end. What we were able to do is we were able to come in and represent the patients. The patients who were told they had cancer and didn't, the patients who were given chemotherapy who didn't need it. A lot of them, it was torture. Chemotherapy is awful to go through for anyone that's ever had to go through it. He had some people on chemotherapy for years. He had some people on a higher level and higher dose of chemotherapy than they actually needed. And there is this provision under the federal law that allows cancer oncologists, cancer doctors, to buy the chemotherapy from the drug manufacturer and then sell it to the patients for a profit.
Wow.
It, to me, makes no sense. I can't believe it's still allowed to happen, but it only encourages this behavior that we saw in Dr. Fada.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It is quite crazy. There's another gynecologic oncologist right now who we're currently investigating, who was doing very similar things to Dr. Fada. So I'm involved in that as well at the moment.
And you were able to help some of the families recover some financial compensation as a result of being victims of Dr. Fada, right?
Yes, we were. So under the criminal case, the patients, they were entitled to restitution, but it was very, very limited. They were only entitled to restitution for like financial losses. So if they had actually paid for the drug out of pocket, then they could get reimbursed for it. They were not able to get compensated for pain and suffering. They were not able to get compensated if they had, let's say, chemotherapy that they didn't need and they developed. I mean, chemotherapy has terrible side effects. Some of them can be permanent, some of them can be long-term, and a lot of people develop these neuropathies in their hands and their feet, and, they weren't able to recover for those damages in the criminal case. And so we were able to get financial compensation from not only Dr. Fada, but the hospitals that were allowing him to, see patients and treat patients there in that litigation.
Yeah, that's, thank you for your work on that. When I heard about that, I actually had one of my clients had been a patient of Dr. Fada, and, we don't do that type of work. We were actually helping him with trying to get long-term care paid for through some of the government programs. But coincidentally, he also was a patient of Dr. Fada, and so when I heard about it firsthand, it's just an unbelievable evil thing that was being done there.
It is. It's terrible greed.
So I wanted to talk to you a couple things. I know that you're active and you were. Again, you're going to have to help me with the details here, but I believe that you were the chair or president of the Women Lawyers Association a few years ago. Is that right?
Yes, I was. Yes, I was the 100th president, which was pretty fun. Yeah, I got to throw a very large celebration, which was a lot of fun.
That's very cool. So, well, Donna, I appreciate you being here. I wanted to remind everybody that we do our training for other professionals in the long-term care field, including social workers that are licensed, administrators who are licensed, and care managers that are licensed. And we've been providing this training for 9 or 10 years now, and it's usually very popular. And so we have our dates for next year. It's going to be on April 21st, which is a Friday, 2023, from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And we're going to be offering 5 continuing ed credits for social workers, nursing home administrators, and care managers. So something to put on your calendar. Hopefully you'll be getting notice of it through the mail and email soon, but save the date. I believe that we actually already have the sign up on, that you can sign up to come to the event right away. So thank you so much, Donna, for your time. I very much appreciate and always had a great deal of respect for the work that you do. So until the next podcast, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.